Welcome to this last week in our look at Paul and the first Christians. And this wraps up not only Philippians, but it's going to wrap up our entire study. And so it's a little bit unfortunate that we couldn't do this together. But the nature of this pandemic that we're all living through, this is just kind of where we're at. And so I look forward to a time where we can gather again and do another study kind of face to face. But this last passage that we're going to look at in Philippians is really based in chapter 4. And I'm kind of cut off some verses there to look at, but verses 4 through 20. And being the end of the letter, this is when Paul really starts to kind of give shout outs to different people and mention different people by name. And so that's why we're just looking at 4 through 20. That's kind of the bigger passage, right? And then I'll kind of walk through a summary of that, and then you'll do your study on the smaller passage of verses 8 through 14. So what's going on in this larger picture of chapter 4? So first off, in verses 4 through 7, you've got Paul talking about joy and peace. So in this letter to the church in Philippi, Paul has been over and over and over again sounding this refrain of joy in the midst of opposition and suffering. Both Paul being in prison and the church in Philippi facing their own kind of opposition and suffering, they're living in anxious times, a life full of anxiety. And Paul is exhorting them, is calling them to a life of peace that is found in the way of Christ. And so there's a practical aspect to this of how to deal with different anxiety is prayers of supplication and thanksgiving. That's kind of some practical ways, but then also looking forward to that, to hope as a way of getting through that anxiety, a calling to this life of joy and peace. And then we come to this next section, verses 8 through 9, very common passage that I'm sure we've all heard, but what we may not quite realize is that Paul is really drawing from some Stoic philosophy, and this is kind of a shock to some people because Paul is really enmeshed in his Jewish way of thinking and teaching and the Jewish scriptures, but we get a glimpse of it in Acts, right? There's this time when Paul goes and preaches in Athens, Greece, and is talking about the poets and philosophers. So in his growing up in Tarsus, a very cosmopolitan kind of city, and in the marketplace, he may very well have come into contact with this. But he's drawing on this idea of if anything is of excellence, then think on these kind of things. And, Christ is before all things. And so if there are things of excellence that are out there, even if they're not within our own little walls and our boundaries, then that means Christ is there as well, if there are these excellent things. And so this is this expansive idea of Christ that Paul is living into. And so there's those verses in 8 and 9 thinking on these excellent things, and that is a way of bringing in this life of peace as well in the midst of anxiety. And then verses 10 through 14, here's this idea of self-contentment. So here we have very specifically his own life in this humiliation, in this cruciform life, and the anxiety that is in this, and how is Paul living in peace. And he's talking about this idea of contentment. Now, we just got done saying that he was drawing from some Stoic philosophy, and now he's actually going to move beyond the Stoic philosophy, because the Stoics would talk about contentment and a self-sufficiency, but their idea of that is more of an apathy toward any kind of circumstances around you, that you create this apathy that it's just like, I don't care what's going on. And then you're able to find that contentment with no matter whatever your circumstances are. Paul, however, has a different move with this contentment. It's not just an apathy, but it's a realization of how he participates in the death and resurrection of Christ, even in his own life and experience of hunger and plenty, of experience of abasement and abundance, that these become teachers for Paul. Not in an apathetic way, but they become teachers for Paul of how Paul is participating in the cruciform way of life. And that's where the contentment and peace comes from, identifying with the suffering Christ and relying on the power of God, the power of the Spirit living through those circumstances. And so we come to these last verses here, 15 through 20, and Paul is specifically talking about this gift that the church in Philippi had sent to Paul. And really, this gift is another example of the cruciform life, that the church in Philippi were experiencing the opposition and suffering, and they did not have a lot of wealth in their own circumstances, and yet they gave. And so Paul sees this act of giving as another way of living into this cruciform life, that the gift itself becomes a sacrificial offering. So there's kind of the big idea of what's going on in Philippians 4, and we're going to jump then into the specific text of Philippians 4, 8 through 14. Finally, beloved, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Keep on doing the things that you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, and the God of peace will be with you. I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at last you have revived your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned for me, but had no opportunity to show it. Not that I am referring to being in need, for I have learned to be content with whatever I have. I know that it is to have little. I know what it is to have little, and I know what it is to have plenty. In any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of being well fed, and of going hungry, and of having plenty, and of being in need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. In any case, it was kind of you to share my distress. So now to dig into this last passage in Philippians, we'll use the same 5 study questions that we have the other weeks. The first 2, what are the key words or phrases in this passage and what do they mean? And then building upon that, then what are the overall themes of this passage and how does that fit into the bigger picture of the letter? Then the next 2 questions really about embodying the text. Put yourself in the shoes of those who first received the letter. What would this letter mean to you, this passage mean to you? And now put yourself back in your own shoes. What does this passage mean to you now in your own context? And then the last question, probably the most important question of all, is through these words that you've been hearing and thinking about and meditating, where is the Spirit leading you? I'm grateful to have had the opportunity over the last several weeks and months, and even though this didn't quite finish the way that we would have expected, where we were gathered together face to face, I'm still grateful for the opportunity to dig into this life of Paul, a man of passion and of mission, to dig into what his context was, the context of the first Christians, and then really to be able to use that to start understanding these letters that we have in the New Testament. So from here, I would encourage you to take the information and the tools that you learned in the first half of our study together and these study questions that we've been using over the last several weeks, to use those to now dig into your own study of Paul, to get into some of his other letters and dig in and learn more from the letters of the New Testament. I look forward to seeing you in the hopefully near future, and blessings on your study, grace and peace.